All right, so welcome to today's webinar. It'll be top 5 design tips for a winning graphical abstract. So that winning is kind of dual meaning because again, we are running a graphical abstract contest. But the tips and tricks we'll cover today will be pretty ubiquitous. So you'll be able to use these tips for graphical abstracts in general, maybe for publication figures, posters, presentations. But there are certain considerations for graphical abstracts that I want to highlight as we go through. So again, a little bit of a breakdown of what we'll cover today, brief intro. We'll dive into the 5 easy tips for a winning graphical abstract. And along the way, we'll actually do a live figure makeover. And it's actually going to be based on a few real life figures that yourself and your colleagues have submitted or volunteered for us to kind of revamp or give a bit of a facelift to see, how do we implement some of these tips in practice. So a bit of background about myself. My name is Shiz, one of the co-founders and CEO of BioRender. And if you haven't met already, my background is in medical and biological illustration. And also on the line, as I mentioned, is Francesca, who heads up our customer success management efforts here at BioRender. So she'll be there to answer all the questions you might have as we go through the tutorial. So go ahead and ask in the, again, Q&A section from the Zoom interface, or in the Zoom chat if you like. Great. So for those that are brand new to BioRender, this is actually a really quick speed through. We're not going to go into the sort of nitty gritty on how to use BioRender itself today. We actually have a webinar tomorrow that's sort of a crash course, BioRender 101, if you'd like to join it. How to register is just go to biorender.com/webinar, and it'll show the list of webinars we have upcoming. In fact, we're running this webinar again on Thursday. It's going to be relatively repeated content. So don't worry about having to sign up for both. It's going to cover relatively the same stuff. But anyways, here's a quick sort of breeze through of BioRender itself. Really cool features to make robust graphics without any drawing skills whatsoever. So go ahead and try that out. It's just biorender.com. You can sign up for your free account. And we will use BioRender as a platform to go through the tutorial. So you'll kind of get a little bit of a feeling of how it is that it works through osmosis. So actually common use cases of BioRender, of course, are publications, including graphical abstracts, presentations, lab meetings. Many of you might be doing lab meetings virtually now, grant applications, research proposals, and many, many more. So let's start by defining, what is a graphical abstract? We all might have slightly different understanding of what that is. It's a relatively new concept and becoming more and more prevalent in sort of the journal cycle or publishing cycle. So a graphical abstract that, as we're defining it, is a single image that is intended to give your reader an immediate understanding of the story's or article's main message. So your graphical abstract should be distinct from figures or diagrams in the rest of the article itself, i.e., it should actually be an overview as opposed to sort of one of those, 6, 9, 10 panel figures in the results section, for example. So here are the 5 tips that we've kind of collated across probably hundreds that we would have loved to or wanted to share with you today. We're keeping it to 5 because I think that's probably enough just to consume within the hour, but they will kind of have subheadings. So we'll kind of go through those in practice together. So 1 is, plan ahead. 2 is to really consolidate the graphical abstract and abstract. How do those 2 interplay? The abstract being the kind of description or the summary of the article itself, as you all know. Sometimes you'll submit an abstract for, say, a poster session at a conference. 3 is to keep in mind, color contrast and saturation. This goes for any kind of figure you make, especially, again, in this case, for graphical abstracts in particular. I would say to use consistent arrows, lines, and labels. We have such little space to work with and so little time to convince the viewers that, your article is certainly worth reading, or your research is interesting to dig into, or your message is important. So using consistent lines, arrows, labels, fonts, all of that is really important. And then finally, this seems a little bit silly, but it is important to kind of do the Twitter/text message test. And we'll show you what that means when we get there. Okay, so number one is to plan ahead. So sketch, flow, feedback, revise. Going back to the poll here, I'm actually going to end the poll. So if you've just joined, go ahead and throw in your votes. I'll give you 5 seconds to do so, just 3 questions there. And then I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so you all can see who else is in the room today. A nice cross section of people who have and haven't used BioRender before. Nice cross section of subfields and specialties and fields of research. And have you entered our graphical abstract contest? Looks like many of you have not yet, but you intend to. So that's great to hear. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, I'll have convinced the few of you that have not submitted and don't intend to intend to submit. All right, so let's go ahead with the 5 tips. So number one is, again, to plan ahead. So to sketch your images, flow, feedback, revise. There isn't much there that I wanted to cover as far as the top 5 tips in a slide format. I'm actually going to do it in a demo. So let's skip over that for now and zip right to number 2, which is, think about the words to describe the graphical abstract. It should actually be less than the abstract itself. So think about your abstract, your summary of your research in, say, 500 words or less, however, the limit is for the journal, or in this case, the contest. Speaking to a journal editor at Cell Press, I interviewed him and asked, I'm giving a webinar on how to make a better graphical abstract. What are some things that the viewers should keep in mind? One thing that came to mind was that editors find that they give you all a sort of word limit for abstract, but that doesn't mean that your graphical abstract doesn't actually have a content limit. It certainly does, and in fact, it actually should be less than what the abstract is showing. It shouldn't say more. It's not an opportunity to add more labels, more content that wasn't able to be included in the abstract itself. So I hope that's clear, that it should actually be almost a subset of the abstract in visual form. So here it is translated. This is an example of some amazing research coming out of the University of Toronto. And they actually did a great job of describing their abstract and putting it into graphical abstract form. Of course, this is made in BioRender. And so we've tried to pare down even further what this abstract, or graphical abstract rather, would translate to in words. And certainly it is less words, but they did such a good job of paring down the abstract, so this might not be a great example. But I think you get the idea, is that, again, the translation from the graphical abstract back into words should actually be less than the abstract itself. So this is a really good sort of rule of thumb to make sure that you don't overcrowd your graphical abstract. You keep it nice and simple, straight to the point, and that there is one main message, 2 at most, but in effect, one main message and a very clear beginning to end. This was another complaint of the editors that I spoke to at journals, and it was simply that it was hard to know where to start and where to end as far as the visual story. So there are some tricks that I'm going to show you to really help you navigate the viewer's eye through your figure. Okay, so zipping down to tip number 3 here, digging a little bit more into the design side of things, keeping in mind color, contrast, and saturation. So there are a couple of things we like to talk about as far as, complementary colors, which is basically a simple kind of fancy, or not simple, fancy word for the opposite color on a color wheel. So if you've attended our previous webinars before, you'll know that we love talking about this. This is simply to say that if you have trouble thinking about how to color match or color pick to compose your figure, this is a really nice tool you can put in your tool belt on how to pick colors for your figure. So say you have 2 antagonistic viewpoints, or signaling pathways, or maybe it's, bacteria overlaid on top of a tumor or something, or lymphocytes. If you use the opposite color, it actually will stand out much more than if you were to use colors that are similar along the color palette here. So the opposite colors in this case shown are orange and blue, literally across from each other on the color wheel. That's why they're called opposite colors. Purple and yellow are across from each other, and then red and green, although we like to shy away from red and green a little bit because of colorblind issues. So here's an example going back to sort of that idea of flow. Um, Basically, any composition that you come across can be deduced into one of these 8 compositions, or layouts, we call them. Basically, in, I guess, the English speaking world, for the most part, we do read from left to right, up to down. And cyclical is another common way to show composition. Z and M shape are also very common. M shape probably more for posters. Z shape for if you have, say, steps 1 to, I don't know, 10 or 20 sometimes. Although I would try to limit those, quote unquote steps that you show, say, in a sequence. It's hard to show it all in a skinny, long line. So sometimes you have to tuck it away into a Z shape composition like that. L shape is also common if you have maybe a large figure in the middle that you're trying to kind of work around. And then fork shapes are generally when you have a decision tree or kind of 2 outcomes from one. This is a nice way to format that. But again, I would never go the other direction, for example, right to left. It should always flow in this direction. And certainly not going bottom up either in any of these formations. So thinking about, kind of sequences and composition and color, this is one way that I like to think about how to better sequence or show clear sequences in your diagrams. Again, you've seen us talk about this before, but even more important for graphical abstracts. So in this case, because we've tucked away the number and the title and the description of each step so closely together, i.e., they're literally just clumped together in one little square or cube, it becomes really easy to kind of realign things either linearly or cyclically. So here it is in kind of practice. See how they're kind of clumped together, the numbers and the pictures and the description? Those 3 elements in each step are A, consistent, and B, they're close enough together as a chunk or a cube that you can kind of quickly move things around. You shouldn't have elements of one step kind of bleeding into the next step. It should be very clear what the borders of each step are. And you should have enough padding in between each step so that it's very clear what visual elements belong to that step, if you know what I mean. So here is a cyclical format, exact same content moved into a Z formation here. Okay. So those are kind of different compositions. Here's a really interesting image that we actually did a figure makeover for a couple of weeks ago, where if you can see my mouse, I'm just going to follow the direction, the original direction that this researcher took. And this is actually in our graphical abstract contest. It's a contestant in the gallery. And we picked it up because we thought the content was really interesting. There was some good use of color here and labeling. I just thought, if we could tweak it a little bit, kind of, bring it to 80% to 95%, why not? So thinking about the flow of information, I'm taking my mouse and I'm going from the top left. So good job there from starting from the top left. Going down in a cyclical format, I'm coming around the bend here. So now we're kind of going cyclical again and then backwards to the left. So not terrible. It is kind of clockwise, so that's not bad. The only thing is, if you look at the intestines up here, it's kind of going left to right. But then in this format below, I'm kind of having to turn my head 90 degrees. I don't know if you're all doing that now to try to see it sideways. But that's kind of disorienting for the viewer. So as much as possible, again, consistency is key. We kind of flipped this bottom part 90 degrees clockwise. So if you can imagine, we just turned this whole composition 90 degrees. And then, if you can follow me here, we 90 degrees, and then we flipped it horizontally 180, so that instead of going this way, it actually went left to right. So here it is in the after, literally exact same content, but we didn't flip our kind of enterocyte layer here 90 degrees. We kept it the same orientation. And then we simply, instead of going from right to left, we went left to right. Now we are going, from the top left down and up. So it feels like we're breaking a rule as far as going, down to up this way. But in this case, it's okay because it's kind of a downstream effect of this epithelial layer that we're trying to communicate. So here was the before. Also, the sequences weren't numbered. So as we were talking about before, it's really important to number your sequences to really just hit your viewer over the head with, where to look first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and last. It wasn't really happening here. I wasn't really sure if I should look down here first. Maybe I should look up here first. So to really hit the viewer over the head, we added numbers 1 to 5. Now, this isn't perfect. Again, we kind of just did this on the spot. So there's probably some things that could have gone in to touch up a little bit. But there is one kind of main message. The large arrow is telling me where to look. There's these sort of smaller arrows that show kind of the offshoots of the story that might not be primary, but secondary to the story. So the size of the arrow is also kind of creating this hierarchy of information, which is important. If every arrow was the same thickness and width and color, then my eye would be confused because there'd be too many competing elements on the canvas. So I hope that's clear of how we went from this to this. Again, just simply thinking about the very rough layout, numbering your steps, and using color a little bit more to describe, kind of the good guys and the bad guys of the story. So here, it didn't really look that bad of a story. Like it looked like the damaged cells were kind of quiescent, or they did look damaged, but nothing to do with inflammation or disease. So here, you really wanted to make it look inflamed or pathologic in some way. So that was kind of described using color. Okay. Here's another before and after we did as a figure makeover a couple of weeks ago. Just wanted to show the results of that before we do ours together today. So here's the before, same deal. It kind of went around the composition in a loop and then back again in this fork. So what we did was, you guessed it, we numbered all the steps. We shrunk down kind of where the pictures are relative to each step, and then fix up the composition a little bit. So instead of going cyclical to fork formation, we chose a traditional Z composition here. You can use your finger to trace over your screen, but it's certainly a Z formation.
Hi, Shiz. Quick
Yeah.
question from the audience. They're just
Mm-hmm.
wondering whether, if there's a case like this in number 6 where there's two pathways where the experiment kind of splits, what would be kind of the best way to represent that?
So in this case where it
Yep.
splits down the road, yeah,
Hmm.
great question. Well, we've done it here by showing it kind of as this little hang off here. But it is kind of a combination of a Z formation meets a fork in the road. So that's totally okay. But, in most cases, I would pick and choose what the main message is. So here it says 5, 6, 7, 8. I could have done 5, 6, 7 down here, 8, 9. For this particular case, I just let it hang off like an appendage that maybe didn't deserve its own number. But you'll have to go in and see if those sort of side stories or secondary stories are worth labeling. Yeah, it'll definitely be on a case-by-case basis, and I'll actually show that to you during the demo itself. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, I think it did. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Fran. And then, sorry, we're jumping around here a little bit as far as color, but on the topic of color again, thinking about saturation, I know we all like to get a little bit creative with our use of color, but we really want to kind of dial back and reserve those bright colors for the most important part of the story. So we always use the analogy of highlighting your textbook or notebook with a highlighter, you don't go in and highlight the entire page, for example. You only really want to highlight the most important areas. So that's the same case for a pathway, for a sequence, anything at all. Your colors are really going to be distracting if you use too much. In a, I guess, perfect world, your figure should actually even stand out in black and white, which is another kind of concept we like to cover as far as testing for contrast. But in this case, take-home messages, be really stingy with the colors you use, really make it reserved for the most important part of the story. So in this case, we've knocked back the color for almost the entire pathway, except this ROS GTP and the ROS, and then you'll see here the before and after. Much easier to focus the eye at the brightest part of that pathway. So speaking of color contrast, this is kind of another take-home message that we always repeat because we do see this kind of time and time again as a mistake in figure making. So what I would do is use the inherent tools in BioRender or PowerPoint or Adobe Illustrator, whatever you're using, and literally just knock out all the color. So preview in grayscale or black and white. And what that does is it tells you what areas of your figure are low contrast. And this is important both if your readership ends up printing out your stuff in black and white, if it gets printed and put up on an elevator or a poster or something like that, or if your audience is colorblind. And then at the very least, if we're all able to see color, you can see that the green and orange really kind of vibrates funny on the screen. And that's because it's so close in color value that our eyes are struggling to focus on the edge of those elements. It's really hard to make out what's what. And then, again, putting it into black and white eliminates color as a variable and really stands out to you what parts of your figure has contrast issues. So here's a really quick speed through of fixing up color contrast issues in BioRender. So here are the tau proteins that are darker if you compare the before and after. And the pink looks okay, but if you preview in grayscale like this, you can see that it almost disappears completely. So this is just an example of how color can be deceiving, and really make sure that you're at least in the final 5 seconds of either before you submit to our graphical abstract contest, or you submit your figure to a journal, or if you go to present during a lab meeting, just do a quick gut check of preview in grayscale and see that everything is still legible, that your words are still sharp enough and bright enough to show up even in black and white. It's a really good test. Okay. The fourth thing here is to use consistent arrows, lines, and labels. And I'm not going to go into detail about this because we'll go through it in the demo in just a minute. But just to say that arrows can communicate very different concepts depending on the type of arrowhead that you choose. So arrows can mean all the things in this folder here. Straight arrows, curved arrows, 90-degree angle arrows, squiggly arrows, dotted lines with arrows at the end. These all communicate very different things. You don't have to memorize what they all mean, as long as you stay consistent. That really is the key. Certainly, it would be great if you could know what each meant and kept that consistent. We've tried as much as possible in BioRenders to label things to help you with that. So inhibitor lines are clearly the ones with the sort of bar at the end. And the dotted lines usually mean a future or past event, or maybe a cut line for, say, surgical illustrations and such. But for the most part, consistency is key. I would say that's the take-home message here. I guess the other take-home message is that all these arrows are available in BioRender as sort of pre-made shapes, but once you drag it out onto the canvas, it'll be fully editable and flexible. So I'll show you how to do that as well. So let's jump into BioRender for a quick figure makeover. I think we're making some pretty good time here. So we've got a good amount of time to go through sort of a before and after figure. So this is the image that we're going to be doing a makeover for. It might look familiar to all of you as far as the concepts. Even if you're not working in immunology or microbiology, or cell bio, or cancer in general, you'll probably still take away some tips on just generally how to lay out a figure once you've kind of put it together and you realize, oh no, it's busy. My colleagues are telling me that I've got to remove things or fix up the layout, but I'm not really sure quite how to approach it because now there's a lot of stuff on my canvas and I don't know where to start. So I'm sure we've all been there before where you're looking at your figure and you know that it's busy and you know that it doesn't quite work, but you are kind of paralyzed by what to do next. There are a couple of tricks you can do. So first, hopefully you won't get to that point because you would have done the sketching prior, but since we'll all start on a clean slate here, what I'm going to do is actually go over to my Photoshop file, which is basically just that picture. I pasted it into a window. Hopefully you can still see my screen here. It's a split screen within Photoshop. Sounds like we're on the same page. No pun intended. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Fran. And by the way, this is just an illusion. I imported this like paper texture just to make it feel like we're putting pencil to paper. That's what I do recommend doing, is using pencil and paper, or pen and paper, and literally just sketch out your ideas first, because nothing beats hand to paper. It's just, I think, the distance that your brain has to kind of jump, that cognitive load is really low, because we all know how to sketch on paper, even if it's really, really messy. The messier, the better, in fact. So let's take this as, kind of retroactively instead of proactively, since we already have this figure made. How would I rearrange this to make the story flow a little bit better? Right now, I'm reading 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I take my maybe brush here, I'll just use a red marker. We can see that. Make it brighter for you. And don't worry about not knowing how to use Photoshop. I'm literally just doing this for presentation purposes. So it looks like we're starting from the bottom left as far as composition. So bottom left is kind of the flow of the blood. And the arrow is telling me, okay, look up here because this is, number 1 in the sequence. So that's fine. And then now I'm going to be looking, I naturally want to go this way, but it's telling me, nope, come back here and look at number 2. So I'm looking at number 2. And my eye's coming here, but it's not 3. So I'm now looking around for 3. It's over here. And then I think I need to look at these 3 things before then moving on to number 4. But I am kind of bouncing around because 2 is also kind of crossing over this way. So a lot of things happening here. If you had kind of sensors on your pupil as to where your eye was going on this composition, it'd probably have all these kinds of lines drawn out over the top of this figure, like so. So the content in this figure is really interesting, scientifically sound, really, I think all the story is there. We have to just rearrange it. So it's breaking a couple of composition rules. So what I would do in this case is, maybe I'll just, lower the opacity of the lines here so it's not that intense. Coming over to this paper, what I would do is kind of, again, pick one dimension or one composition, whether it's left to right, up to down, maybe it's cyclical, maybe it's a Z. And the other ones were, I think, M or a fork in the road. One of these 6 or 7 or 8 compositions should work well. Generally speaking, I'd like to start in the top left because that's where, even if you read a piece of paper like this is how you start. You don't go this way. So why don't we draw maybe the blood vessel up here? By the way, I think for the graphical abstract contest, the size restrictions are 7 by 10, so about, I don't know, here-ish. So we'll just draw a little line there. So we draw the vessel maybe up here because it's top left. The the blood is flowing from right to left down. So I'll go maybe this way. And I'm going to draw some cells. Imagine you just have a piece of paper here and you're just scribbling. This is interesting because I'm just going to keep picking at this drawing. So thank you for those that volunteered your figures because, again, beautiful. I'm just doing some tweaks here of how we'd fix it up. It's interesting because number one, I actually thought that they were showing the cell migrating from the vessel. In fact, they were actually just showing, a zoom in of this cell. So it's kind of one of those anatomy of figures instead of migration. Down here, we're showing migration of the neutrophil squeezing through, or the CAR T cell squeezing through that vessel. But that's not the case in number one. It's actually just a zoom in. So here's kind of an inconsistent use of arrows, like I said. I don't know if you all thought that as well, that the cell actually exits the vessel here. So in that case, what I'm going to do is actually use one of those anatomy, trusty anatomy zoom call out things, because we don't really need to show that it's traveling just yet. In fact, that's not part of the story. I mean, I might do one of these things. And then, obviously have the CAR proteins on there. So that's, maybe step number one, just orient your viewer. This is, step one or the first point. Number two is way down here. And I think I'd prefer to have it up here. So I'm going to have the cell squeeze through the vessel up here. And then, the idea is kind of trafficking, it looks like, trafficking. So this is point number two. Got some good layouts here already. It's almost cyclical. Okay. And now maybe the tumor's got to be, in this kind of general area, but again, don't have to be perfect. And number three, tumor microenvironment, or TME. That's one thing as well. I'd probably describe this or spell it out. It looks like they probably did in the description. If not, then I would definitely spell that out and not use the acronym, at least in the description itself. But, say that the TME, I mean, this whole area is the TME technically, but, maybe I'll just label that up here. And then this could be maybe number three. So 1, 2, 3, and then you guessed it, maybe if we can somehow, if everything falls in line, put 4 down here, that would be great. So let's add one more T cell down here. And it looks like it's interacting with a tumor cell. That's great. And there's a bunch, kind of blebbing off. It looks like that follows pretty well. So this is the main story. I've ignored all of the other things because I think, these tell the bulk of the story. Now, there is a secondary story happening in the middle where there's the T regulatory cell and the MDSC cell. So maybe I'll just throw those, I don't know, in the middle here somewhere, and they do something like this. They're inhibiting the CAR T cell. They're cytokines, or what are these? PGE2, adenosine, etc. Some other stuff. Again, doesn't have to be perfect, but you can see here the general flow now is definitely much more sort of fluid than the previous. There's not a lot of things. If my eye had to follow the trajectory, it would probably follow this with maybe a little mini arrow coming this way. And that's it. That's the entire story, as opposed to before where we were kind of, jumping all over the place, left, right, and center. Okay, so compositionally, I'm pretty happy with this. I think we cover the bulk of the content in the previous image, in the secondary image here. Does everybody see that, hopefully? Okay. Great. So with that in mind, I'm going to, let's see, maybe I'll just screenshot this part and bring it into BioRender. I'm going to toggle over here. For those that don't have an account, it's really easy. Here's a login page. If your school has institutional access, it'll look a little different. It'll have kind of the SSO portal or single sign-on portal, but I'll go ahead and log in here. This is my account. So all my illustrations in the bottom, templates along the top, templates in this tab, you're welcome to use as starting points for your figure. Again, I won't go into the nitty-gritty today of how to use BioRender. I'm actually going to go into my trusty graphical abstracts folder and open up that figure that was sent over. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here for the sake of time. I actually have, oh, you know what? Because I copied that Photoshop image, this Photoshop image on my clipboard, I'm actually able to paste directly into BioRender anything at all, whether it's a graph or a logo or anything like that. You can actually import stuff into BioRender. And I love doing that as kind of like a sketch or an image that I'm going to be tracing. Just stick it onto the side here as kind of inspiration. All this area in the gray is actually your space to kind of just add stuff. It's your workspace and it doesn't get exported. So if I were to hit preview, it actually doesn't show in the final export here. You see that? It doesn't show the sketch because it's only rendering what's in the canvas. So I'll leave my sketch up there, and this is actually a fake screenshot, so I'm going to move that to the side. What I've done to save us time is same thing that we did for that image with the gluten and the enterocytes. This image here, I've kind of flipped the composition. So here we flipped it 90 degrees. In this case, I've also done the same thing. So according to my sketch here, I brought the vessel up to the top left. And what I'm going to do now is make a little box here for the CAR T cell. So it's kind of like one of those, anatomy of images. Send to the back. So it kind of, it exists in the story, but it's kind of a little bit independent. It's like a little bit of a call out. And I could leave the background color just so it looks a bit different, but again, you have to be careful about color value, because if it was about this color, it kind of disappears, it camouflages. You don't want your image to camouflage. In fact, if I preview in grayscale, you can see that it kind of disappears a little bit. So if I work in grayscale, you should kind of make sure that it's bright enough. So I'll do a soft overlay of gray. Okay. And in BioRender, you can actually curve the edges of the square. I'll just keep it straight for now. Another thing I would do is, you'd be surprised how much detail you can actually include in the micro to macro scale. So in the original, I actually didn't know immediately that this CAR T cell was the same one floating in the vessel. I almost, in my mind, I mean, I knew that the CAR proteins were on there, but I almost, in my brain, at first glance, thought that it acquires those proteins once it leaves the vessel, and that could be a mistake that your audience assumes just off the, top of their head. So what I would do is maybe just copy and paste this and shrink this down so that it actually has those proteins on it. It doesn't hurt to kind of just, show that it's consistent. Again, consistency is key here. You could even add, a couple of these CAR proteins on this migrating T cell. So if I type in CAR, got a couple CAR proteins, and this is kind of the bread and butter of BioRender here, is this huge library of icons. So again, if this is your first time seeing BioRender, I hope it's not too disorienting, but I'd go ahead and search up our gallery. And this is a grouped icon, so I can kind of go in and remove pieces of it if I want. It looks like for this purpose, I actually don't need some of these pieces of the CAR protein. So I'm actually going to maybe remove or shorten the stick. I hope it's not too small. I'm going to zoom in for you here. So if you really want, you can start to even add these to the edge. Now, it probably doesn't help the story in this part of the, communication of it, but maybe just to stay consistent, I would actually add those in. And then, of course, make sure it's the same color. In fact, just to save time, I probably would have just copied it from this car T cell and just stuck it on. Because again, consistency is key here. If you're going to show it green in one section, you should just stick with that in another part. Okay. So that's that. What I also like to do is add in kind of lines to show that it is zooming in. So this is backwards. I'm going to flip the fade so it's the other way, and then just copy and paste here, like so. So now this is kind of just showing this is a zoom in of that area. It's not necessarily, the cell migrating in and out of the cell. Okay, so that's pretty clear, I think, going from left to right here. It looks like antigen heterogeneity is shown with that little circle, so maybe that's important. I'll also do that to highlight maybe that area, like so. And, you have to kind of think about the placement of your labels. A lot of the times, I would say 90% of the time, it ends up being, how do you kind of just push and pull all of these labels around to make things fit? And, believe it or not, even designers, we spend a lot of our times, we call it pixel pushing. And we don't necessarily, love that part, but it is where the magic happens, is when you start to nudge things around, make them fit, and then ultimately be able to add things into your composition. I also think this is a rare case where the labels are actually quite large. I'm actually going to shrink it down a little bit, maybe to a size 12. Did I hear someone unmute? No? Okay, no questions, I guess. Great. And you'll probably guessed it, we are missing one thing that is crucial to sequential images, and that is, again, numbering. So what I'm going to do here is add some easy numbers. So let's see here, going up to BioRender, and also again, referring back to our sketch. This is number 1 down here. So text shapes is our handy sort of numbering system. I like this 1. So I'm just going to click onto my canvas, and right away it creates a beautiful, perfect circle with a number 1 on it. In fact, I don't really have to do much to it. It's just kind of there, ready to use. So I can do something like this. And I'll need a number 2. So I'm going to option drag, which just copies that. 2. And then I think 3 was the sort of tumor microenvironment, which doesn't really describe much. I read the description. It was actually related to several hostile barriers in TME that inhibit the T cells. So they've labeled 3 here, but I just went ahead and kind of labeled that a little bit clearer. So 3, and then again 4 is down here. Okay, so what I would do is probably kind of go in and kind of finesse this a little bit. I think these cells are looking a little large. Again, this is a bit secondary to the story, so this could be tucked away a little bit. It's not the main message that you have to look at right away. It is important, but not necessarily the main flow. And let's see. I think this also
Hi,
needs
Shiz.
editing.
Quick
Yeah.
question from the audience. They're just wondering when it's the best time to use dotted lines versus faded lines versus just normal arrows.
Yeah, great question. It really is related to consistency. So if you start using dotted lines to show movement, it's probably the best to keep using that. This is interesting because the story is actually not that this T cell migrates to the cancer cell. The story is actually that it's difficult for this T cell to find or migrate to the tumor cell specifically. So to help with the story, to make it look like it may or may not reach there, you actually use a dotted line in that case. So dotted lines are good for something that's a little bit uncertain. That's why it's dotted. It's not solid. That's a really good way to do that. So maybe the blood flow is very certain, and maybe the migration, we want to show it's maybe uncertain. Of course, if your point of the story, if your thesis was, yes, it always finds the tumor, you probably want to make this solid just to prove a point. But if you're trying to prove a point that it's actually difficult for the T cell to even find its way, migrate out of the tissue, and end up at the tumor, the site, or the TME, then the dotted line is really good. Again, it's kind of an unsure, uncertain before or past event. So that's what I would use for dotted lines. I would even add a fade to this line. So look at the before and after here of the fade. Kind of adds a little bit of a movement to that. So that's what I would say as far as consistency, or when to use dotted versus solid.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And then moving down here, I do want to say for certain, again, I want to convince my reader that this does happen and can become an issue where the T cell can get exhausted. And maybe I'll just push over the label over here. Again, it is going to involve a little bit of push and pull, but this arrow is looking a little bit flimsy. The thickness of this arrow is almost the same as my secondary story or my, best supporting actors versus the main actors. So I'm going to thicken this a little so that, again, my audience knows exactly where to look next and where to look first. Okay, so already we're getting this nice cyclical motion. Let's check back with our sketch to make sure we're indeed following what we said we were going to do. And we're kind of getting that story flow, which is great. Top, down, kind of left to right in the same formation. And then looking at the before, I think we did a pretty good job of kind of realigning, all the steps from 1, 2, 3, and 4. Just checking if we're missing anything. Numbered our images. We've labeled everything. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Of course, again, the main thing is, again, to be nudging things around to make sure it's clear as to where things are. One thing that you might have noticed that it's not consistent is 1, 2, 3, 4. The kind of subheadings for each number is not consistent. So hostile barriers in TME should be, I guess, bolded in a different font size. So this is 12 font size. This is, what is this one? 15. So it's inconsistent. It doesn't look like they actually belong to the same family. So maybe I'll go ahead and make them all about a size, let's say 13. Let's see what that looks like. That's looking pretty good. So at first glance, I know exactly where to look. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like so. And let's do a final gut check of color contrast here. So preview and grayscale, looking pretty good. If I move from a top left, it looks like the T cells are getting a little lost in that blood vessel color, if you can see. In fact, all I can see is those CAR proteins and not really the T cell. So if you really want, you can actually go back in and adjust the maybe color of the vessel background. That's probably something you could fix. Probably could even remove it completely. But maybe I'll make it more of a whitish color just so that those T cells will stand out brighter. Let's see what that does. Preview and grayscale. And you see how that automatically at least does a little bit of adjusting as far as how bright those cells are in comparison. Okay, so I'll stop previewing in grayscale, back to color. All right. Maybe I'll do a little adjustment, you see here, so that 2 does appear before the 3 at least. And I think overall looking pretty good. And let's see, let's export that. So I'm going to preview. In BioRender, you can actually export JPEG, PNG, or PDF. And then you've got 3 resolutions here. I think on the free version, you do get the basic resolutions. And then the higher you go with the tiers for the subscriptions, the higher the resolution. But for the most part, I usually like to pick JPEG and then 150 DPI. And I'll export that. And it's going to download right to my desktop. And what I'll do is come over here and add it to my sort of after slide. Oops. Insert image. And this is the same way you would import a picture, say, into PowerPoint, if that's ultimately where you're going to use the figures. So it's looking a little large here, but it's the right dimension. Here's the before. So let's toggle between those two. Here's the before. And here's the after. So much cleaner design. And you saw that I really didn't do a whole lot. The content was all there. It was really just to readjust the flow of information, the contrast, the consistency of the arrows, and really adding those numbers so that you just really kind of beat your viewer over the head with where to look next and what they should be focused on. So again, here's the before. A little confusing as to maybe where to focus the eye. And here's the after. Maybe I would have made the inhibitor lines red if that's, something that's kind of bad for the body versus good for the body. In this case, the lymphocytes are kind of working against us because it is preventing the action of the CAR T cell. Okay. So that was a nice kind of before and after image. To wrap up here in the last minute or two, I did talk about sort of the Twitter or text message test, which is a really nice way to think about what is the whole point of a graphical abstract in the end from the point of a journal, for example. A lot of the times, according to editors, it's actually a really nice way for them to even share your image or your research in social media posts. So this was a nice one that this individual posted on Twitter. And you can see that the little card or the preview image that shows up is actually, I think it's a graphical abstract actually. So if your graphical abstract can communicate the entire research concept independent of the article in times like this where it's completely disconnected from the article itself. In fact, it does the opposite where it becomes the advertisement for them to be invited in to read the article. That's really the job of the graphical abstract, is to also be able to stand alone and communicate the entire story. So we also mentioned text message because if you were to text this figure to a colleague that understands science, or maybe that doesn't understand science, and they read back to you what they're seeing in the figure, independent of the article itself, then you've done a great job of communicating the message in the picture. Okay. So just think about, why are they asking me to do a graphical abstract? Why are journals needing this? It really is to capture your audience to want to read the article, as well as be able to disseminate the information more widely, say on social media platforms. Great. All right, so 1 hour sped by really quickly. I hope you were able to take a few tips from that tutorial and from sort of the theory behind it. Again, I highly recommend applying for our contest. It's really easy. I say apply, but literally if you have a figure made in BioRender already, it's probably suitable for the contest itself. You can see the range of quality and simplicity. This is actually a beautiful one I'll call out. I think it was just added today. Yep, just 3 hours ago. Look how simple it is. This is probably a winning graphical abstract right here. Just how simple it is and how much they've deduced the information. That's a lot of the work, is really deducing the information that you're communicating. Here's another great one. And yeah, I'm definitely not lying when I say, these are all real scientists, real researchers putting together figures in BioRender. Definitely not medical illustrators, because there are so few of us that I probably know the handful of them that exist in the world. And I'll also say that our medical illustrators that work at BioRender have done a lot of the work for you already. So this heart, these lungs, they're all made in BioRender as drag and drop icons. And that really elevates the figure sometimes if you want to throw in a nice image or two. Here's a cool one of a TME. So lots of different types of figures. You can get pretty creative with the type of images you submit. The idea really is to make an image that summarizes a concept, whether it's published research, it could be unpublished research, it could be a concept that you're just interested in, it could be someone else's research. So a lot of the times, individuals have recreated an existing graphical abstract and just kind of put your own spin on it. Maybe you can do what we did today, where we did a before and after, and you can revamp a graphical abstract that exists out there that's, published in Nature or Cell or what have you, and then submit that. Of course, you have to cite, your sources properly, which is why you'll see that here in the references section. You'll have an opportunity in the submission form to add that. And the submission form itself is actually really, really simple. So if I enter now up here, you really only need a couple of things to get started. The figure that you made in BioRender, you can actually select this to choose your figure. So, I'll just, upload the figure that I've already made. Voila, already loaded. And then all I have to do is add in a title, description, and really the rest is just kind of fill in the blanks, probably a couple of questions there, accept the terms, and then continue. The next steps are really easy. It's just, add in maybe a couple of information points about yourself, and then hit send. So nothing to lose. Lots of potentially some nice cash prizes to gain, as well as communicating with your colleagues. So you can actually start to connect with scientists from around the world. For example, if I open this image and I click on this person's profile, I see that they're a graduate student at the University of Sao Paulo, looking for collaborators on my research. And it's really cool because if you can resonate with the topics that they're researching, you can actually message them and say, hey, I like what you did there. What are you working on? So I love that we're kind of encouraging that sort of community and driving those communications when we're all really isolated right now, and there's no way to communicate that like the way we used to do at conferences, at least for the foreseeable future. So go ahead and submit. Again, nothing to lose, and hopefully this webinar was helpful to kind of kickstart, give you guys a bit of a head start in as far as making good designs. So we've recorded this webinar. Your comments have not been recorded. Don't worry, in the chats. It's going to be only the screen that I was presenting. And you can review all the content at your own pace, but check the email that you signed up for the Zoom webinar with, and we'll send you the information there. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you sticking with us to the very end here. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Again, if you're looking to get a bit of a crash course on how to use BioRender, join us tomorrow for the BioRender 101 session. Again, it's just biorender.com/webinar, and you can pick one of the times here. It looks like you all joined our Tuesday webinar today. We do have another one Thursday, but we're probably going to cover almost the exact same content, to be honest. So you won't have to, attend both. In fact, if you just rewatch the YouTube channel that we send out, that's probably going to be good enough. But if you do want a little bit of a crash course on how to use BioRender, go ahead and click this Wednesday, May 27th, 101 session. Again, it's a free session. We'll go a little bit into details on, how to use arrows, where do you find the icons in the app to use to make your figure. Those kind of nitty-gritty things. You're welcome to join tomorrow. Okay, thank you again for joining, everybody, and stay safe, and look forward to seeing you submit to our graphical abstract contest. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.